Good evening. I'm Allison Byerly, president of Lafayette College, and I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to tonight's Jones Visiting Lecture. This is, of course, the first time that we have held such a lecture on Zoom instead of in Colton Chapel, where we traditionally have held this event. And so we're very, very pleased that so many of you have been able to join us this evening. The Thomas Roy and Laura Forrest Jones Visiting Lecture Series was founded by Trustee Emeritus Thomas Roy Jones in 1973 in an effort to provide Lafayette College students with the opportunity to hear presentations and interact with distinguished individuals of exemplary accomplishment in the academic world or in public life. Some of our past Jones Visiting Lecturers have included Derek Walcott, Ursula K. Le Guin, Henry Louis Gates, Susan Sontag, Francis Fukuyama, Simon Schama, Stephen Sondheim, Elizabeth Colbert, Amitav Ghosh, and Kwame Anthony Appiah. We are delighted that the 2020 Thomas Roy and Laura Forrest Jones Visiting Lecture will be delivered this evening by Dr. Siva Vaidhyanathan, the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Dr. Vaidhyanathan is the author of Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, The Googlization of Everything and Why We Should Worry, as well as a number of other books and frequent writings for The Guardian, New York Times, and other periodicals. You also may have seen him on CNN, BBC, ABC, or The Daily Show. Tonight's program is going to follow a more interactive format than a typical Jones lecture. Dr. Vaidhyanathan will make opening remarks, and then he'll follow up with some questions from several guests that we have joining us tonight. Two faculty members, Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies, Catherine Grew, and Ben Cohen, Associate Professor of Engineering Studies, are joined by alum Amanda Pisetzner, class of 10, who is an Emmy Award-winning producer for Vice News. So the three of them will get us started with some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. You can enter those questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. And so you can write those questions in at any time. We'll collect them. And then we hope to get to a number of them at the end of Dr. Vaidhyanathan's remarks. It is a tremendous pleasure to welcome Siva Vaidhyanathan to Lafayette College. Please join me in welcoming him here tonight. Dr. Vaidhyanathan.
Thank you very much. I wish I were with you at Lafayette College right now, but I really want to thank everyone for inviting me into their homes, which is essentially what's happening tonight. I guess it's even more of an honor to be invited into your home, and that you've given up some time on an evening you could otherwise be spending watching Netflix, which is, I think, what we've all been doing pretty substantially for the last few weeks. So I am going to share my screen, which is this, weird thing that we do in Zoom, which will let you see the slides that I want to present to you. So please excuse the awkwardness of the following process. So let's see if it works right. Good. So far, good. And I hope that's good.
Yep.
So can one of the panelists or all the panelists give me thumbs up if my sound is good? Is it all good? Great. 100%. All right. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the concept of cacophony. I'm going to make an argument that we've been thinking about free speech, about the role of facts, the role of fiction, and the role of fakeness in our society, all wrong. We're using old frameworks. We're using 18th, 19th, 20th century frameworks to discuss a media ecosystem that is unlike anything we've ever had before. And it has tremendous implications, not just for the functioning of democracy, but for our ability to even make it through and live a good life. And I hope I can make that case to you this evening. Basically, I'm calling for a 21st century analysis of our problems of communication. I would like us to think in fresh ways about the ecosystem we have, the technologies we have, the norms and expectations that we have, our laws and regulations as well. So what I'm offering is an ecological approach to our media and communication systems. That means I don't just want to talk about technology. I often write books and articles that put technological innovation as the first order of, or the first subject of analysis. But I always try to hit the norms, the laws, and the institutions, which I think are all in concert with and in conversation with the technologies and the companies that give us these technologies. So my discussion today is influenced by a number of recent works. You can see two of mine up there. I had to throw them up there. It's, got to do some self-promotion. But look, there's been a whole lot of work in the last few years about the ways that our information ecosystem and the habits of our political communication around the world are changing rapidly and substantially. We have well-documented accounts of the ways that our new media systems are being used to harness the will of movements, the ways our new media ecosystems are being used to corrupt democracies or undermine democracies. And I want to argue that these are of the same process or of the same phenomena. And I think we really have to look at all of these things and how they interact. Now, back in 2011, I published a book called The Googlization of Everything, in which I argued that our remarkable and rapid outsourcing of decision-making to this one company was ultimately unhealthy. It was a function of our desire for convenience and an effort to make sense of the flood of information that was suddenly available to us, right? So of course we go to Google, not only to find out the answer to a bar bet, but maybe to find our way to a new restaurant in a new city. And I wanted to argue that that level of dependence was ultimately unhealthy, not harmful in any immediate way, but in the long run was going to do us more harm than good. And then in 2018, I published a book called Anti-Social Media, which takes on the ways that we have now filtered so much of our activities through Facebook. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is bouncing off of those two books. Now, what I'd like you to take from this is the core lesson that I think we need to get back to first principles, core principles, when it comes to talking about free speech and free expression. Why do we have free speech and free expression? What is it for? Well, primarily, as James Madison saw in the late 18th century, citizens in a democratic republic needed to be able to deliberate and debate and express themselves without fear of the government stopping them from either seeking out information or expressing themselves and arguing about that information. But remember, primarily it was about our capacity as citizens in a democratic republic. That's what education was all about. That's what the First Amendment was all about. Now, the First Amendment, of course, in the United States means so much more than that now. The First Amendment is crucial to artistic expression, crucial to all sorts of ways we relate to each other. And it's grown in scope, and it's grown in its effect on people's lives. It's never affected us equally by any means, and there's never been a golden age of free speech. But I would argue now that we're in a golden age of maximum speech. So let me get a bit where that is. Get you a bit where that is. Look, in August of 2017, the town in which I sit right now was invaded by thousands of extremists, thousands of mostly men who were determined to do us harm. They were determined to frighten us, to shout us down, but they were here to do more. They brought weapons. They brought clubs. They brought flaming torches. They beat up pretty severely more than 40 of my neighbors. They murdered one of them. They put a good number of them beyond that in the hospital. And 2 state troopers died because their helicopter crashed in the aftermath of these events over one terrible weekend in August of 2017. Now, the thing was, in Charlottesville, we did our best to try to get this demonstration moved to a park where the demonstrators could express themselves, but they would be contained and separated from those of us who opposed their agenda. So the city decided to grant them a permit only if they were to rally in a park and not next to the statue of Robert E. Lee, which is in the middle of a neighborhood, which is 2 blocks from the center of town, which is 2 blocks from a synagogue. A federal court decided at the last minute that this requirement that the demonstration be in a park infringed on the First Amendment rights of these Nazis. Now, the judge did not consider the thing that was most crucial to the citizens of Charlottesville. The fact that this was not just about speech. The fact that these people came here meaning to do harm. They were very clear about their desire to threaten, to frighten, to terrorize, to beat up, and to kill. And in fact, they did. They carried through on their promises. This didn't have to happen. But that court decided that this was all about speech, whereas the city of Charlottesville was saying it's about more than speech, right? Because when one side is well armed, the other side cannot speak. In this country, the Second Amendment trumps the First Amendment. So that's one event that has, as you would understand, affected my thought, affected the ways that I've thought about so many of these issues ever since 2017. But that's not all there is. So I want to take you back to 1969. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland caught on fire. Now, rivers aren't supposed to burn, right? This is some biblical stuff here. In fact, rivers had burned pretty frequently throughout the 20th century. As American industry poured petroleum-based waste into waterways around the country, with cities like Cleveland facing the greatest environmental degradation. But this particular fire in 1969 gained a lot of attention. At that point, we had a media system that was willing to take it seriously, that was willing to say, you know what, this is odd, this is scary, this probably shouldn't happen, and it was dramatic. And so people started talking about it. Now, it wasn't a direct line of cause and effect, but 2 years later, Congress passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and President Nixon, a conservative Republican, brought into effect the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, this was the culmination of more than a decade of environmental activism and policy discussions, both in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country. Over that time, Americans realized that their water was filthy, that their air was filthy, that their highways were filthy. We were able to talk amongst ourselves, like grown-ups, about serious issues. And we pretty much decided that we don't want our rivers catching on fire. And since 1969, rivers in this country have not caught on fire. Now, in that period of time, and again, not just the 2 years, in that period of time, we had debate among differently minded people, right? People with different values and agendas. Some argued for free market intervention. Some argued for serious state intervention. Others argued for, a liability-based regulatory system. We ended up with a pretty hybrid system in which there are market forces on companies that do bad things to the environment. They're not very strong, but they exist. There are scientists at the EPA who set standards for pollution, and then the EPA is able to fine companies when they exceed those standards. And of course, we can sue companies for the damage that they do to ourselves, our children, our bodies, our communities, etc., right? So, not to say this was a perfect situation, but let me tell you, if you were around in the late 60s and early 70s and you're around now, you couldn't really do a lot of things like go jogging in Los Angeles at that time. The air and the water in this country is substantially better than it was in 1969 or 1971, largely because of those two acts and the EPA. We'll see what kind of unraveling we're doing to it now, but nonetheless, this is an example of a problem we all agreed was happening. There was no denying it. In fact, that's what I wanted to get across to you. In 1969, no person said, I don't really believe the river's on fire. Well, today the whole world's on fire, and we can't get to step 2 in that conversation. We can't have a grown-up, serious, informed deliberation or debate about what we should do about one of the things that is most threatening our species and many other species. Why? Because every time we try to take the problem seriously, someone distracts us, someone sweeps us off of our stride, someone makes absurd claims, someone doubts expertise, and we spend all of our time rebutting absurdity, and we spend none of our time actually addressing these problems, or very little of our time, or certainly insufficient time addressing this problem. So again, in 1969, if anybody said, I don't believe the Cuyahoga River's on fire, that person was never taken seriously, was never put on cable television because we didn't have cable television, was never tweeting about it, and we didn't have to worry about it if that person even existed, right? That is not the case now. Now there is cacophony. Now, there are other forms of cacophony. There are other ways in which maximum expression is getting in our way. Beyond polarization, right? I'd like to put polarization to the side. Everybody is yelling all the time. Yelling is the default mode in this age. Now, there are times when one should yell. There are times when we should expect people to yell. But I think we've gotten to the point where yelling is expected. Now, this is not actually a free speech problem, right? It's been presented that way, right? These darn kids and their assaults on free speech. I think we're looking at it that way, the wrong way. If this were just about free speech or free expression, then those who yell have just as much right to speak as the formal speakers do. In fact, those who yell have something to say. So we can't frame this problem as one of free speech merely, or we miss the point, and we fail to move ourselves toward a more healthy information ecosystem, one in which we might actually take each other more seriously and more sincerely. We fail to behave as responsible, informed citizens in a democratic republic. So this phenomenon is known as the heckler's veto. There's a legal definition of the heckler's veto that's pretty technical and it involves state intervention. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the colloquial sense of the heckler's veto, right? It's one in which the heckler has the power to shut down whatever speech act was supposed to happen or was expected to happen or to which an audience had arrived to have happen, right? It's often the tool of the powerless. Right? It's meant to give something to those who do not have power, who do not command attention, who do not have other outlets to express themselves. Nat Hentoff, the famous jazz critic and free speech advocate, wrote for the Village Voice for many decades. He described the heckler's veto as an instrument of censorship. And so does Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of the University of California, Berkeley Law School. I think they're both approaching it in too simple a way. Because hecklers' vetoes are also instruments of expression. They're not healthy, they're not deliberative, but they are not just about free speech. They are about more speech, too much speech in some cases. In fact, hecklers these days, whether they make themselves known in a lecture hall or they make themselves known through social media or in other online formats, are essentially engaging in what computer scientists would call a distributed denial of service attack. The idea that you can mess up a communicative process, mess up a network of communication by flooding it with data, by flooding that network with stimuli, by making it overflow and lock up. And we see this so many times, so many ways. Distributed denial of service attacks, whether intended or not, organized or not, or just inspired. We see it in India, for instance. It's one of the places that I think is a very important place to pay attention to these sorts of things. Anyone who criticizes the current ruling government of India, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, is often subject to a sort of distributed denial of service attack that is quite dangerous. Critics of the government, whether they're scholars or journalists or activists, generally face a barrage of threats of rape, threats of killing, threats of kidnapping, threats to their families, threats to their places of business, to the point where whether they're legit threats or serious threats or not, they make it almost impossible to get through the day. They make it almost impossible to do one's work. And that's really the purpose, to disrupt the process of communication. And in India, it's working brilliantly. And by the way, this distributed denial of service attack occurs almost entirely via Facebook and WhatsApp. And of course, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. Right. So what happens when the person with the most power deploys an instrument designed for the powerless, like the heckler's veto? I mean, what is the goal of flooding our system with nonsense that makes it impossible for citizens to get through a day or a week without shaking their heads, without getting an immediate reaction? It seems like an effort to put us all off of our game, right? To make it so we're we're not able to deal with systematic, concerted thought about our problems in the world. And how is this 21st century ecosystem enabling this, encouraging this, even amplifying this condition? Well, look, Facebook is but one problem in this, right? We have multiple platforms and multiple problems. They involve the constellation of television networks around the world, constellation of social media platforms around the world. We have direct person-to-person communication, and we have actual human beings live yelling at each other, threatening each other, getting in each other's faces, messing with each other. So it happens in multiple levels, in multimedia forms. But of course, we can't ignore the role of Facebook. Why? Because Facebook has 2.5 billion regular users. Nothing in human history has ever touched that many people at once. Well, air, water, and Facebook. It pretty much goes in that order, right? Nothing in human history has ever worked its influence on 2.5 billion people at once, besides Facebook. YouTube, by the way, has about 2 billion regular users. So YouTube is fast catching up to Facebook. Nothing comes close to this. Twitter only has 330 million users. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, has about 1.6 billion users. WhatsApp has about 1.5 billion users. Most of the top social media platforms are owned by Facebook. So in terms of scale, and in terms of the way that these services focus our attention, grab our attention, monitor our attention for the sake of selling ads, and because they work through algorithmic amplification, we have a media system that is overly dependent on the work of Facebook, YouTube, and Google, which YouTube is owned by Google, by the way. And this system basically distorts everything, distorts media choices in every possible medium, including some of our oldest. So the concentration of power in the guise of these filters is one of the core stories here. We try to manage the cacophony of the world, the overstimulation we all feel. We try to manage those things through Facebook and Google. We are outsourcing decisions to Facebook and Google. Facebook and Google help choose for us who we will communicate with on a given day, what information we will consider reliable, valuable, inspirational, interesting, right? They are mediating those decisions for us because we are so overwhelmed by everything else. So they are our chief ways we try to manage cacophony, and it's not working well. It does not work because these services are not designed to foster deliberation. They're designed to foster motivation, to do something, to click, to buy, to express oneself, to organize, to vote. And democratic republics need both motivation and deliberation. We focus too much on things like truth tests and fact checks, and we miss the point. We miss the problem. Hannah Arendt thought about a lot of this stuff long before Facebook ever showed up. She lived through so much turmoil, so many unexpected degradations of human dignity and of democracy. And she saw a lot of this coming. So this quote, and I try not to lay big quotes on my audiences, but I think this is a really important one, basically makes the case that those who hope to undermine our ability to govern ourselves aren't interested in making us believe a set of lies. They certainly aren't interested in playing the game of what's true and what's false. That's something the rest of us seem to be obsessed with. They don't care, and ultimately, they don't want us to care. They want us to just give up on distinguishing between what is true and what is false, to the point where it just doesn't matter because we're so distracted and we're so exhausted. So this is where we are now. We are at the beginning of one of the great devastating global crises, right? Our current crises forces us to think through basic questions. How shall we live our lives? How can we address a global pandemic and a global economic depression if we can't think and speak like grown-ups about serious issues? This moment, more than any in the past few decades, demands clear-headed deliberation, and we seem so unable to get to a state of clear-headed deliberation. This moment demands trust and expertise, but expertise has been systematically undermined for years. It demands an understanding of the processes that experts use and the contingencies that they build into their conclusions. And we're impatient for that. This means that one of the things we have to do, perhaps the most important thing we have to do, is enhance and reinvest in the institutions that foster knowledge production, that foster science, that foster deliberation. This means we should be reinvesting in institutions like schools, museums, houses of worship, institutions of journalism, scientific laboratories and organizations, colleges and universities, the very places people gather to deliberate, the very places that enforce norms of deliberation. But we're doing just the opposite. In fact, our economic crisis threatens to undermine all of those things in a pretty serious way. And frankly, as this event shows, we can't even gather. We can't do anything but simulate an environment through which we might try to deliberate. So we have a lot of work to do once we get out of this darkest of moments. When we can all get together again, we must not let go of each other. We must treasure our ability to deliberate. We must get better at it. We must fight the urge to yell at each other. We must fight the urge to troll other people. We must fight to reinvest in institutions that deliver no immediate gratification, because that's actually what we're talking about. We have plenty of institutions that deliver immediate gratification, like Netflix, like Facebook, but a college, a university, that's all about deferred gratification. That's all about investing in one's ability to think about things that aren't that fun and aren't that engaging in a moment, and working hard to work through difficult concepts. And we've built these institutions knowing that we can't just entertain ourselves all the time. And we really have to reignite that sense of value as we go forward. Now, when Thomas Jefferson wrote about the value of free speech, when John Stuart Mill wrote about the value of free speech, when Louis Brandeis wrote about the value of free speech, they were writing into a quiet and dark world. One where most people couldn't read, one where there was no electronic communication, although in Brandeis's later years that certainly was the case. And basically, look, we've spent more than 300 years on this planet changing laws and norms and expectations and technologies to spread the number of people who could speak. And we've had remarkable success at this. So now almost everyone can speak, but not everyone can be heard or understood or respected or taken seriously, because power matters here. And in a state of cacophony where everyone can yell all the time, the most powerful still get to prevail. We haven't solved the power problem of our communication system. But the problem is not censorship anymore. It's cacophony. By the end of the 20th century, we had largely solved some of the major speech problems of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The 21st century presents a whole different set of problems. 1/5 of the way into this century, we have not yet begun to consider those problems with the right language or the sufficient thought processes that actually acknowledge and address the problems themselves. So the problem's not who can speak, it's who may be heard. It's not what can we read or what may we read, it's how are we going to learn to think again. Now, Hannah Arendt used to include in her letters to her friends a phrase. It shows up all over her letters. And it's not the most erudite phrase. It's certainly not one of the long sentences she tended to publish. It's a pretty straightforward phrase. Stop and think. That should be a lesson to all of us going forward. If we can build in that notion that we need to stop and think, build it into all of our systems, all of our habits, all of our institutions, we might have a chance to get out of this most dire of circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siva. I'd like to, I see that we already have some questions that have come in, but I'd like to begin by asking a couple of our panelists to engage with some questions that they may have on their minds after hearing your talk. And so let me begin by asking Catherine Grew if she has a question she'd like to address to you. Might take us a minute to get everybody.
I'm unmuted.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Siva. I really enjoyed it. And I have a lot of questions, but I essentially have one sort of big question under which there's sort of two ideas that I'd like to throw at you, if I can. And I can't see Siva moving, so I hope that he's still with us. Okay, he's moving. Yeah. Okay, so I'm interested in this. I mean, you ended on a note that I thought was pretty optimistic, given the route that you take through Arendt. And I'm interested if you could say, I mean, what you're describing essentially is in some ways not about maturity or about a sort of regression whereby we've in some ways ceased to think, although perhaps some of us have. But I think that part of what you're describing is technology being put to the use by a kind of totalitarian political operation, which is a very dark way of starting to think about what in fact is happening. That what's in fact happening here is that technology is being used in some way to create cacophony. That noise has become a kind of, it's a political tool. And, you know, that you suggest in the end that there's a sort of, it's not that it's not working and that we can't communicate with each other. We've somehow ceased to be able to, you know, communicate, but like there's actually technologies being used towards, you know, in ways that it work really well if the end is oppression, right? If the end is a really kind of strong totalitarian political position. So I guess I want to just put a little bit more pressure on like, you know, how we do sort of pull that apart in some way, if this is in some ways not like we're all talking too loudly, but that these technologies are actually being used quite forcefully to create cacophony, right? Like to create noise, that is a political purpose in itself. And then second point I just want to put on the table if I can is, so I'm teaching right now a sound course on sound theory. And so your title, Cacophony, is one that I just, I'm very interested in. And we're actually reading an essay this week on gender and sound. And we're reading Anne Carson's piece on the history of that term, cacophony, and where she traces that term as, and you yourself talk about like, you know, the kind of, you know, who's showing up in the public sphere right now are, you know, white supremacists, and the kind of noise that's being created is the noise of the powerful. But historically, that term has been one that, you know, we've been trying to sort of eradicate the noise from the public sphere, is about eradicating the voices of women, the voices of minorities, is about, you know, the sort of getting back to seriousness, and silence is about exerting the authority of the powerful. And so I'm wondering if you, where your work sort of sits along recent sort of calls for anger and rage and more noise on the part of certain members of our democracy, whether, how you're sort of thinking about, like, is there any kind of politically effective way of using noise? Yeah. So those are sort of my two big, like, power questions.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, I mean, what we have is a media system that is designed for particular commercial purposes. It is to compete for our increasingly scarce attention. And it is meant to focus our attention very sporadically on very heavily targeted, precisely targeted advertisements and pieces of content that carry those advertisements. All right, so you have multiple forms of media all trying to grab us for 5 minutes, hoping to grab us for a half hour, settling for 5 minutes. What do you do when there are that many different sources of stimuli and you're running these companies? You're going to double down on your efforts to attract attention. You're going to be more spectacular, more salacious, more sometimes more subtle. You're going to not want to invite people in to explore ideas in depth. That is, as I said, designed for explicitly commercial purposes. There's a vicious cycle of that. The authoritarian, certainly the totalitarian, I think we have many more authoritarians than totalitarians these days, although we certainly have a few. The authoritarian loves this, loves to be able to take advantage of this, right? Loves to take advantage of the dystopia that Aldous Huxley described in Brave New World. One in which, counter Orwell, we don't necessarily have to be directly oppressed by the state. We choose to entertain ourselves, to fracture our attention, to lighten ourselves to the point where we're unable to engage in the process of governing ourselves. So the authoritarians around the world, whether they are active in Ukraine or Poland or Hungary or India or Cambodia or Thailand or the Philippines or Brazil or the United States, are all thrilled with our current media system because they do hinder our ability to execute any serious politics, whether left, right, or center. All politics becomes unserious. All politics becomes rendered cartoonish. And that's a perfect environment for the tyrant. In terms of anger and voice, I'm all for it, right? And I'm all for using these systems and understanding their value in harnessing and focusing. What you see behind me in my screen right now was the counter-protest, the reaction to those Nazis marching through Charlottesville in August of 2017. About a week after, maybe it was 2 weeks after they left, and we were all so bruised, and we didn't know how to react. We had all of our civic leaders, our religious leaders were stunned. Some of them were in the hospital. Students who had not yet in large numbers returned to Charlottesville in August, on the second week of August 2017, returned by the third or fourth week and said, we are going to do something. Now, those Nazis had marched through the lawn at the University of Virginia. The buildings that you see behind me were all designed by Thomas Jefferson. This is sort of what they call the academical village, the intellectual and social heart of the University of Virginia grounds. We don't use the word campus because, I don't know, we're eccentric. And the students said, you know what? We're going to take it back. And they started a process of recruiting and organizing what ended up being 6,000 or 7,000 people, students, staff, faculty, and people from the town, all came on to the lawn that night. But here's the thing, they could not use, and we were all told not to use any social media to make this happen. We were told to communicate only through email and through word of mouth, to tell people where to show up and when. Why? Because the Nazis had infiltrated all the activist groups, just as the activist groups had infiltrated the Nazis. We didn't want them to know that this was happening because we didn't want another showdown. We didn't want them to return with their clubs and their guns. This was an amazing evening. And you might remember when those Nazis marched through the streets of Charlottesville, one of their chants was, "Jews will not replace us." Well, when the students were able to organize this and we filled the lawn, one of the chants that we shot back at them is, "We replaced you," right? So we have these amazing opportunities to, with very little effort, right? Very little excess effort, to organize massive numbers of people to make a strong stand. And we need to be able to have that and also be able to speak clearly and intelligently about problems. So we should have moments of noise and moments of focused anger and well-articulated anger, right? We should not hesitate to have that, but we have to have it within an environment in which it gets through, the message gets through. We need to have it in an environment in which it might actually lead to something, changes of mind and changes of policy. And right now, all we have is the anger. So I think the idea that cacophony or the polyphonic claims that were being silenced through the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, that was all very valid. I think we've turned that problem around a bit. And it's not that we need to undo that in any way. I think we have to approach these questions in a fresh way and say, how can we have both? How can we have a polyvocal polis? How can we have multiple voices, multiple accents, multiple languages? How can we have that kind of orchestra in our lives so that you can hear all the different voices, but we have the potential to actually seek answers to a common set of problems that affect us all. In the book that I'm writing, from which this talk emerges, I'm identifying three major problems that we don't seem to be able to think and talk about very clearly. And people around the world are going to have different approaches to these problems and feel them differently. But one is climate change. One is human migration, much of which is caused by climate change, and much of which generates the kind of backlash that put those Nazis in my town. And the third is global infectious diseases, which I had thought was a problem and now seems like the problem. So I'm not happy to be on time for that one. So I hope I got to a lot of what you were getting at. But I'm totally with you on that long-term critique of silence.
Thank you. I think Ben has a question as well. And you have to, yep.
All right, now I got it. Thank you, Siva. Thanks, Catherine, for starting us off as well. I mean, I have a host of questions. I'll try to reduce them to maybe one at this point, and I don't even know if it's answerable, but I'd just like to hear like how you think about it or how we could talk about it. I actually had my own coincidence of reading materials because we've been talking about the origins of modern digital communication in my history of technology class. And we just worked through the shift from the 70s to the 90s, where the decade of the 1980s was known as the decade of civilianization for digital communication networks. So it moved from being primarily military to being offloaded to become more of a civilian. And it was explicitly not commercial. Like it was defined, it could not be commercialized until it was sold in the early 90s after an NSF shift, and becomes in the 1990s more of the both civilianized and commercialized network that we see, which opens up the way for all the systems and social media and communication environments that you write about. So on the one hand, that strikes me as pretty recent. Like this is a very recent phenomenon in the longer struggle for speech, action, for communication, for community. And at the same time, what I think about is the ways that these technologies are invested with certain design principles and design values. We take it as a premise that, you know, digital communication networks are not neutral, they're not value free, they can't be, they never will be. But the primary design ethos has been to foster values of commercialization and the private sphere of marketplace values. You've already talked about, you know, if we could think about what it means for an engineer to invest the design of digital communication with principles of deliberation and engagement and participation, all the key terms that you had noted. That seems like, I don't want to be Pollyanna about it, it's not an easy thing, but we're only a couple decades into this. If we think a couple decades into the future, is it possible to redesign or redevelop or move forward in a different direction?
No. Well, okay. I don't want to say a blunt no. There is currently no incentive for any commercial actor to enhance systems to foster deliberation. There's just no payoff. And we shouldn't pretend there is. And we shouldn't pretend that all the ethics we teach in college, all the ethics we teach in engineering schools, are going to make any sort of difference to the commercial imperatives of any company that is trying to compete for this increasingly scarce share of attention. That's just not something we're going to be able to address through the commercial sector. We can, however, address it through non-commercial sectors, which is why I put so much emphasis on investing in institutions that can give us someplace else to think and talk, some other way to explore the world, some other way to interact with each other. And we should increasingly treasure those things. In fact, I wish we would give up all hope that companies will treat us better. So we just get over that. So we do two things. One, invest in the non-commercial sectors, in the institutions that we built up over centuries to help us do this work, number one. But also, so we appropriately and sternly regulate companies through the instruments of government inspired by the power of democracy, right? So if we, the people, can articulate a need and we can convince our legislators that that need should be met through regulation, much like we addressed the environmental problems that we faced in the 1960s and 70s, then we are at least approaching it in a realistic fashion. So look, there are people who work at Facebook and people who work at Google who would love Facebook and Google to tweak their systems a bit so they did less damage. And those companies do have some incentive to do cosmetic changes. They'd like to take the heat off so that there is no regulatory intervention. I get frustrated with that process, that hope. I think ultimately that yields only cosmetic changes. And I think our situation, not only in this country, but around the world, is way beyond the cosmetic.
Thank you.
I'd give Amanda a chance to ask a question if I could. Amanda.
Hi, Amanda. Still muted. We're getting.
Yes, you have to unmute yourself as well as being unmuted by the host.
There we go.
There we go.
The amount of times I'm told I'm muted on a Zoom call every day is more than I ever thought. Because I'm the third panelist to ask a question, I'll try and pivot some of mine to the solutions-driven space of this talk. Because in preparation for this panel, I was thinking a lot about the internet and social media and just how it has evolved. And it doesn't evolve like animals. It doesn't evolve to do what's best or smartest. It evolves to do what's easiest, what's most profitable, what's most accessible. And I think we know the problems of Facebook in part because of the work that you do, and part of the work of other academics, journalists. So we know Facebook is bad. We know it has evolved. And I say Facebook as a placeholder of lots of the big ones. We know these sort of loci of cacophony are bad. But I am as guilty as anyone of clicking the accept terms of use. I'm engaging with it.
Right.
And so, yes, the problem with Facebook is Facebook, as you've said before, but I am also part of the problem. And I'm curious, the first question is, what are the best ways that you have thought about and that you continue to think about to engage with this kind of apathy, for lack of a better word? And I'll call myself out as someone who sometimes just, clicks and
Right.
says it's going to be fine and I don't have anything to hide. So whatever. I am. And then my second question, also a little bit, maybe not in the solution space as much, but, I was reading an op-ed you gave in I think it was the Times a while ago, about how, we can't expect these companies to do the right things for us. It's just not, they're not meant, they are not incentivized to, we have to change their business for them. And so there are these kind of examples of these large businesses, these private companies that are private companies, but they're a certain kind of private private company that is almost acting like a public utility and should maybe therefore be regulated differently. And there's been different attempts at that, some more successful than others in the last couple of years. That can, I think, bring up some slippery slopes. And so how is the best way, first question, how is the best way to engage in apathy? And the second question, how do you kind of create infrastructure around the hopeful legislation and regulations that should apply to some companies rather than others, so that people aren't like, whoa, this is not cool. This is not capitalism. This is not what we're about. Those
Right.
are my two questions.
Yeah. So first, let me absolve you of your guilt. Don't feel bad about clicking through the user agreements. Nobody can read all that. There are a handful of people in this country who read all those things, and they are privacy activists. There are about a dozen of them. They are serious people, and they get paid decent money to do it. And all those things we click through are intentionally designed to make it hard for us to read them, understand them, react to them. And of course, we can only reject them. We can't amend them. A contract, right? If I'm signing a contract with Vice News to write a piece for Vice, I'm going to look at the contract and I can mark it up and initial it, and they can mark it up and initial it, and we go back and forth and negotiate all sorts of terms. That's how contracts work. But these click contracts, click wrap contracts, they call them, have no ability for the powerless or the low power person to negotiate equally with the higher powered person, which is a fundamental violation of the principles of contract law, but no one seems to care anymore. So don't feel bad for not reading that. There actually isn't much we can do as individuals. There isn't much we can do to behave better and improve the situation, for the fundamental reason that you and I are but 2 of 2.5 billion people who use Facebook. And so if we were to quit Facebook in anger, Facebook would not care. If everybody who's listening to me right now, 100 plus people, quit Facebook tomorrow, Facebook would not even notice. And within the time we have spent tonight, Facebook would have signed up 1,000 new people in Brazil. Facebook is growing at an incredible rate. If we had done this conversation a year ago, well, I would have been at Lafayette, which would have been lovely. But a year ago, Facebook had 2.2 billion people using it. It's now 2.5 billion people. It may actually be higher now. They haven't put out a number in a few months. There's really not much any of us can do individually or in any sort of collective number that is reasonable, because Facebook is so big, because Facebook is so powerful. It's so embedded with power structures around the world. Now, what can we do in terms of regulation? Well, there are a few things. So in Europe, the European Union last year put into effect a pretty sweeping data protection law that means any citizen of Europe has the ability to know and understand what their data is being used for by these companies in clear language, right? It can't be in these long, tangled legalese statements. It has to be very direct. That any data that had been gathered before can't be used for a new purpose without explicit consent from the user. All kinds of these little rights. And it's going to be a while till we see how effective that is, but that's a pretty good model for limiting their power. It gets annoying. It's one of the reasons you have to click through the I agree to every website these days, is because of that European law. And all these website developers and these companies put those annoying things in there basically to make us sick of the law so we don't like it, mostly Europeans, but it does serve a purpose. I think it remains to be seen whether that law is going to have enough teeth, but it's a pretty good model for how we might go forward. When people talk about regulating Facebook as a utility, I'm never really sure what that means, or Google as a utility. I'm never really sure what that means, because I know how electric companies and water companies and gas companies are regulated, and they provide commodity to consumers, and they do so at regulated prices, right? So there's a price to be regulated, and there's a process to be regulated, and there are environmental standards, and there are regulatory commissions in every state that handle those things, including insurance, which is not a utility. But I just don't see how what Facebook and Google do map to that. They are completely new animals in the world. We've never seen anything like them. I often think reaching back for historical precedent for them misses the point most of the time. But anyway, I think there is room for more creativity in the regulatory area, and I'm hoping that I can, maybe by being really depressing, inspire people to be bold and original in those areas.
I'd like to turn to a couple of questions that have come in while you've been speaking, and a couple of them fall into a category that links nicely to what Amanda spoke of in thinking about the role of the individual. A couple of people have asked, in contrast to the sort of political and institutional emphasis of your take on how these media companies operate. A couple have asked about how much human nature itself is at the root of how Facebook operates. One guest has written, empirical research shows people are much better at exploiting social media to get negative messages across than good messages across. Do good people need to take the step of gaming algorithms and manipulating social media systems to get their message out, because that's the only way it can be done? Somebody else has asked, how is it Facebook's fault when Facebook wouldn't survive without humans? In other words, isn't it the humans who are the problem rather than Facebook that is the problem? And so I'd be interested in hearing your sense of how much, is this avertible because it can speak to a better side of human nature, or is it simply part of the human condition that we are drawn to the negative more than to the positive?
Right. So I want to encourage people not to make distinctions between ourselves and our technologies. Our technologies are extensions of ourselves. But what I mean by they're extensions of ourselves, which is a phrase Marshall McLuhan came up with in the 1960s, it means that technologies make some things about us stronger and other things about us weaker. So a light bulb is essentially an extension of my eyes. It helps my eyes do more longer into the night. A bicycle is an extension of my legs. It's, it is something that focuses the muscle power of my legs and makes my legs more efficient so I can move faster and at a longer distance with the same amount of energy. They're just more efficient than my feet, right? A bicycle is more efficient than my feet. So all of these technologies are extensions of ourselves. Facebook is as well. Google is as well. The telephone is as well. And so it's not that it's either Facebook's fault or people's fault. There are people who want to do these things. Facebook makes them more powerful, makes it easier for those people to do those certain things. Facebook also makes it harder for other people to do other things. So Facebook makes it easier to motivate and makes it harder to deliberate. Human beings, some of us want to motivate. Actually, we probably all want to motivate. Many of us want to deliberate. But Facebook is a machine that favors one thing over another. So yes, we are a fallen species. We are sinful. We are really bad to each other. One of the interesting things about Facebook, if you look back, and one of the things I did for my book is I read through everything Mark Zuckerberg ever wrote or said in his entire career, like since college. And I was struck by the notion that he has no sense of the tragic. He has no sense of the damage that human beings are capable of doing to each other and have done repeatedly through history. But knowing what we know about us, that we are cruel and brutal and selfish animals, you really should anticipate certain behaviors when you build systems if you don't want to encourage those sorts of behaviors. But in his naivete, in his belief that humans are just like him, that we all mean well and just want to talk to each other over distance for innocent purposes, recipes, puppy photos, all the good things in life. Look, Mark Zuckerberg is a kind person who surrounds himself with kind, intelligent people. And so he cannot imagine that our species is full of unkind people, right? But that's the case, right? So yes, absolutely. Human beings are horrible. And we should know that when we build things. It took a long time for automobile companies to build into their systems the fact that human beings are careless, that we tend to get drunk, that we tend to drive too fast, that we tend to fall asleep at the wheel. And what happened over many decades, largely through government pressure and regulation, is now car companies anticipate those sorts of behaviors and do what they can to build in systems that might limit the flaws of us as human beings. So that's really what I mean by the interaction between technologies and people. It's not an either or situation. We are part of Facebook. Facebook is part of us. We change Facebook and Facebook changes us.
A couple of people have asked questions specifically about the affordances of technology, trending in either a positive or a negative direction, just as technology. One viewer asked, how do you think advancements in automation and artificial intelligence systems will impact this media cacophony?
Yeah. So in fractured ways, right? So artificial intelligence, which is this big, messy term, generally these days means machine learning. It means that machines repeat their actions, generate data, gather data from what they've done, work they've done in the world, and change themselves, adjust to certain situations toward a particular end. An iterative process that requires a tremendous amount of data and many processes, but we now have a lot of data about the world and human behavior and machine behavior, and we have the ability for computers to run processes super fast. So we're able to simulate all sorts of things, and machines are able to learn from their own actions over time. So that's kind of where we are with artificial intelligence. We're nowhere near the Star Trek version of artificial intelligence, and we probably won't get there. That seems to have been a diversion and distraction. How will it affect cacophony? Well, in some unpredictable ways, and so I'm not going to go out on a limb and try to predict. But there are ways in which we can train machines through AI, right, to help filter out distractions and filter out problems. And there are ways in which we can train AI to do the opposite. One of the problems with machine learning right now and all of these intensive data-rich systems that depend on tracking human behavior and discerning patterns in human behavior is, again, human beings are flawed animals. We tend to be racist, we tend to be sexist, we tend to be ageist, we tend to be selfish, we tend to be focused on the immediate, and all of those biases get built into systems. So notoriously, machine learning systems are being used to predict recidivism at sentencing in courts all over America. And what happens when you run someone's certain data points, neighborhood, age, gender, even like birth rank in the family, first, second, third, fourth, the machine will then try to predict that person's likelihood to recommit a crime based on historical data. But of course, historical data is influenced by all of the racist systems that have informed law enforcement for 100 years. That's where all our data comes from. So of course, African-American men are going to generally, or people, at least people from a particular zip code, which might mean African-American men or Latino men or African-American women, are going to come up with a much higher predicted rate of recidivism, which has nothing to do with the individual who might or might not commit the next crime. So we're seeing real dangers there because, again, we're running these systems out without proper interrogation, regulation, or transparency. We're rushing into this. Elvis Presley said famously, "Fools rush in," and we haven't seemed to have learned from Elvis.
A couple of questions also return to the overall issue you raised of sort of structures of power and kind of related to the question that Catherine raised about the voices that are silenced versus the voices that are loud. One version of this question is as follows. Siva, I wonder if you're proposing that the problem of cacophony stems from the top down or the bottom up. Does the power at the top aim to create cacophony, or is it created by the virtual mob itself, regardless of what those in power intend, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, all of the above, right? So, remember when I opened saying we need to take an ecological approach to this, there is not one center of the problem. We all contribute to the problem. We are all victims of the problem. Well, some of us are more victimized than others, right? So, because certainly there is a class of people who are totally working this. One of them happens to be the president, who, through his entire life experience, was perfectly prepared to ride cacophony into power. Cacophony and chaos, right? And that's what he did. And so like he found a game he could play that was perfectly designed for his style, and it's worked. The moment was right. The media systems were right at that moment, and he totally took advantage of it. And 100 other things had to go right for him between October 1st and November 12th, 2016, and they all did. So he's president. Does it come from above or below? Yes. We have, look, again, we're animals who love immediate gratification. And that's why for centuries we have had and built up habits and institutions and codes that try to get us to resist our most immediate urges and try to get us to step back and think and contemplate and deliberate and meditate and consider and stop and think. And I think that is, it's never a really satisfying answer because it involves a lot of hard work and reinvestment in things that actually aren't so new. But I think looking at our new systems, all I can see as a way out is to invest in our old systems that have served us well.
And if I could follow up on that in a question, of course, on my mind as a college president, I love to hear you talk about the role of institutions and the role that they play in teaching the habits of deliberation that are needed. When I think about the way you talk about the negative effects of mediation as it is played out, on these platforms, and contrast that with what we try and do at colleges or in museums, which is the kind of curation in contrast to that. How do you see the role of institutions going forward as the media landscape grows and we become more embattled, more threatened, certainly financially threatened in the current moment? How do we preserve a sense of that distinction, or conversely, how do we ourselves use media systems to integrate them and amplify what we try and do as cultural institutions?
But that's the tough one, right? I mean, look, I think we can never give up reminding people why these institutions exist, and they've existed for some very good reasons and some not so great reasons, right? So, one of the reasons that institutions of higher education have existed for a long time was to reinforce and stratify class distinctions. For a long time, they were there to enforce racial distinctions and gender distinctions as well. And they still echo those patterns. And we're all trying to work not all of us, but a lot of us are trying to work very hard to undo those patterns and maintain and promote the good stuff that we do and open up opportunities for more people to be invited into this process of acculturation. And we have to be really blunt, and maybe it's not in your interest to be blunt about this, but I'm just a professor, so I can do it. A lot of what we do at institutions of higher education is acculturation of people into the educated middle and upper middle classes of the world. We create a cosmopolitan strata of people who can then move around the world, move around different cities, and operate at a pretty standard band of wealth and comfort. And we do it not so much by teaching them skills, but by teaching them almost without intending to how to dress and talk and relate and socialize, right? It's all the acculturation thing. And the marker of having a diploma from one of our fine institutions, it's a marker that, hey, here's a person who was able to put 4 years of concerted effort into a project and didn't have the distractions of the military or of family or a neighborhood that was too destructive and dangerous to put this person off of that process, right? So that kind of filtering goes on. But you come out of these institutions with that diploma saying, hey, look, I did this. And the rest of the world applauds and says, okay, you can at least interview for this job, right? I know that's a really cynical way of looking at what we do. It's not all of what we do, but I think at some point we have to understand that that's the baseline of what we do. What we can do beyond that is help inspire people, not enough people because we need to work on more, but inspire people to think in deep ways and discern the sense from the nonsense. And ultimately, that's what we help people do. We hope that the people who graduate from our universities can tell the difference between sense and nonsense and can understand that statistics can be used to oppress you and statistics can be used to enlighten you, and the difference between when one is happening and when the other is happening, right? Those sorts of basic things. So there's a story we have to tell about these institutions. It's not necessarily a story I just told. As I said, that's not in your interest to tell that story, but hey, we have different jobs. But one of the basic things is that if we are going to succeed as a democratic republic, or at least revive any hope we have of self-governance, we're going to need these institutions to foster broader public discussion, not just the education and training of young people, but a fuller engagement with the process of public deliberation about our issues, so that our experts can get out and have their work translated clearly to a larger public, so that their work is understood, the processes of their work is understood, so they are not considered the enemy and not considered the other in society, but actually are considered a deep part of society. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've made that cultural argument sufficiently yet. But I think that's an urgent call.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I think we're getting close to the end of our time. I'd like to do one more question from the audience, and then see if maybe one more panelist would like to throw in a question as well. A member of the audience has asked, what is some of the work being done currently in terms of the regulatory frameworks and investment of institutions that you discussed earlier, and how might this help delimit the cacophony?
Good. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the regulatory efforts that are being proposed in North America and in Europe and in some other places, I think are helpful. They're largely insufficient, right? They're necessary, but insufficient. And I'm not sure that they're going to address the larger problem of cacophony sufficiently, but they might shave away at the edges of it. So one I've already mentioned is data protection law, something we've never seriously considered in this country. We really have to. We have to understand that each of us produces a tremendous amount of data by virtue of just walking around with a phone in our pocket. We create a tremendous amount of data. We must have some stake in how that data is used and potentially abused. That should be order number one. The second is antitrust, or what they call in Europe competition law. There are ways in which, and we've already seen companies like Google and Facebook, there are ways in which these companies can face extra scrutiny for the fact that they behave in anti-competitive ways. That doesn't necessarily mean break them up the way that antitrust law broke up Standard Oil in 1910 or AT&T in 1984. That might be the way forward. I'm not convinced that that's a viable thing for either of these two companies. Nonetheless, there are ways to institute stiffer penalties and stiffer consent decrees that can limit their anti-competitive behavior and offer some potential for real competition. The problem is we should not put too much faith in competition. Having a world with 3 or 4 major social media companies that do bad things is not necessarily better than having a company with 1 or 2 social media companies that do bad things. That's just more companies doing bad things. I actually think the very concept of Facebook is a problem, but we're not putting that genie back in the bottle anytime soon. So anyway, those are 2 of the regulatory things I would like to see happen. There are some other regulatory interventions that might involve the limitations on the ways that campaigns can be done through Facebook, to limit the ways in which ads and campaign ads are micro-targeted at people, so that I might see very different ads than what my wife sees, even though we live in the same house and are voting in the same races. One candidate might tell me one thing and tell my wife the exact opposite thing, and there's no way that we would know because we only see it on our Facebook pages. And there's just no accountability for that. I'm not saying that happens a lot, but if it does happen, we don't even know it. And there are ways, regulations that don't violate the First Amendment that can make sure that that doesn't happen. So I'm all for exploring those things. But again, none of these things strike at the heart of what Facebook is and what Google is. And I think we have a long way to go before we imagine ways to strike at the heart of them.
Thank you.
They aren't the only problem.
Thanks. I think Ben has a good final question for us.
Hey, Ben.
Right, I think I'm back. Yeah, I I'm interested in all this. We're 75 minutes into a lecture at a small liberal arts college in the United States in 2020, but it seems incumbent upon somebody to say something about neoliberalism and capitalist imperatives. And we haven't used the word neoliberalism yet, so I'll end it by saying or asking, in many ways, the problems that we're addressing are problems of being so deeply embedded in the private free enterprise marketplace that we can't even envision any other way out. So we can't keep just drilling inside the structure of the free market capitalist system that we're living in, which suggests to me that a lot of the ways forward, not just like next week or next year, but next 10 or 20 years, are going to be questions about how do we revisit the larger shifts necessary in terms of pushing or recovering questions of the public good. I know we've mentioned public utilities and deliberation in the public sphere, so that it will take the political changes to recover this sense of not creating for the marketplace, but creating for the public sphere. Or building a media ecosystem that's for the public sphere, or in it, like your background picture where people worked outside the media system that you're talking about to build exactly that, a public sphere gathering. Do you see, or could you, I guess, finish the conversation by offering some thoughts on what it means to put the political changes first and then the expectations on these media companies to follow that?
Right, exactly. Well, so, I mean, that's one of the sort of macro lessons I put both into Googleization of everything and anti-social media, my last two books, is fundamentally, we should not look to market actors to fix themselves. They have no incentive to, they have no reason to, but bizarrely, we keep asking for Tesla to solve our climate problems, right? That's just absurd. And we keep asking Facebook to solve our internet pollution problems. That's also absurd. They will make it look like they are, and they might even be sincere about it, but at the scale of Facebook, it's just plain impossible. What we need is a recognition that these problems are political. We also need to revive a few ideas that were in currency before 1981. 1981 was when Ronald Reagan became president of this country, and it was 2 years after Margaret Thatcher became prime minister of the UK. And there was a pretty serious shift, not just politically in both countries, but a real shift in what was considered possible in the whole vocabulary of policy and politics. And it occurred really fast. It's really astounding. Those of us who were alive and aware during those years barely even noticed what happened until a few years later. Certain ideas, concepts, and proposals were just off the table. And one of those was the idea of market failure. So market failure was the reason that we have public broadcasting in the United States, the reason we have NPR and PBS. Public failure is the reason that in the UK they have the BBC. And of course, all three of these are continuously threatened and denigrated by, powerful people. But look, the reason we have the Children's Television Workshop, funded by the Corporation of for Public Broadcasting, is that people making policy decisions in the 1960s recognized that the market had no incentive to provide educational television to America's young people. That the people making decisions about commercial television networks had every incentive to sell Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms and embed cartoons around those commercials, which is fine. If you're into that, don't take that away from anybody. But there must be something more. And so the reason we have Sesame Street, or had it, now it's on HBO, long story. The reason we had Mr. Rogers, may he rest in peace, was that some very smart people said, the market has failed. The market will always fail. The market will not support these important things, this really important value, educational television for children, just to name one thing. We also know that the market will not support K through 12 education at the level and at the scale that we need in this country. We know that the market will not take care of parks. The market will not tend to highways. The market will not build airports. So we have to, if we want those things, the public must make up correct for the failure of the market. That notion of market failure evaporated really fast in the 1980s to the point where policy arguments based on market failure just went silent. Just, you could not get anyone to take that argument seriously. When I look around and I say we lack the instruments for deliberation, we lack the fora through which we might actually discuss and debate and deliberate about how to address climate change or what to do about this current crisis of a virus, that we can't even sort through the nonsense to have a decent level public discussion. I don't see the market stepping up. I don't think that the structures we have allowed to be built around us will foster that on their own. I think we can maybe change some incentives through some regulation, but we also have to invest in institutions that will let us do those things. Now, I listed the classics, right? Museums and schools and universities and colleges.
Libraries.
Yeah, libraries is probably the best one, right? But that can't be the whole list. There have to be institutions I've never thought of that we can build, that we can enhance. And they don't have to be buildings that stand in a town. Right? We might build structures that operate through these screens that we're looking at right now. We might build systems that operate in a more virtual way. We might build other systems of deliberation or habits of deliberation. We might be able to improve our instruments of government to allow for more public voice in decision making. But we just have to take the problem seriously and say the market will not do it. Market failure is a real thing. You have to correct for market failure. That's kind of a out of fashion idea. I think we need to revive it.
Thank you very much, Siva. And I appreciate that even in identifying market failure as the problem that has gotten us here, you've also, re-energized our commitment to institutions and recognized that in addition to the wonderful institutions that we're all part of, including the one pictured in your own photo and the one that many of us are sitting at today, there are also new institutions that our students can build in the future that would help get us to the kind of space you imagine. I'm sorry we didn't get to welcome you to Lafayette College in person, but I hope that you can visit our beautiful campus sometime. In the meantime, thank you so much for spending the evening with us. And thank you to all of our panelists for being part of a really terrific discussion. We appreciate it very much. And thanks to all of you who were part of this conversation as well. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Have a good evening and stay well.